Hi everyone, Jordan Abney here, Executive Director, BC School Sports, here with your monthly April update and our annual video explaining the motions coming to the floor for the AGM approaching in April. To start off, some quick updates. We are into our spring season of play. Reminders for your deadlines. April 10th is the team registration deadline. Again, that's when you must declare your team, meet minimum numbers, and have a coach listed in stars. May 1st is the roster deadline, which is when all student athletes must be on the roster in stars. BC School Sports and the Board of Directors have approved a new Student Leadership Scholarship. In partnership with the National Federation of High School State Athletic Associations, we are offering 2 students, 1 male and 1 female, the opportunity to attend the National Student Leadership Summit in Indianapolis this summer. NFHS has graciously offered to pick up many of the costs, and the scholarship available from BC School Sports will cover the cost of getting to Indianapolis. It's a great opportunity for 2 student leaders that are currently in grade 10 going into grade 11 next year to go represent BC and bring back some great experiences and information for your athletics program. So if you have a student or 2 in mind that you think would fit that bill, please check out the BC School Sports website and consider sending in an application with your students for the Student Leadership Scholarship. Some exciting announcements regarding some of the work being done behind the scenes. BC School Sports has launched a competitive fairness committee. This committee has been operational for the last couple of months and has had a number of meetings. Looking forward to our first in-face meeting at the AGM in a couple weeks. This committee is tasked with looking at all aspects of competitive fairness and making recommendations to the membership on various policies and changes that may help maintain competitive fairness or enhance competitive fairness as it stands right now. The other big committee that is just launching is the Governance Committee. As you saw in the strategic plan that was finalized last year, the membership was concerned and was looking for some leadership in changing governance where we can do things a little bit better. To this effect, the board has approved a committee, an ad hoc committee to look at this, as well as hired an outside consultant to bring a third-party expertise to the process. This committee is in the process of being finalized in terms of who's on it. They'll be meeting probably 2 or 3 times before the end of the school year, and then going back in the fall when we return with the hopes of making a recommendation to the membership in January of 2020 that will then come to the AGM next year in spring of 2020. Speaking of the AGM, obviously it's fast approaching, it's right around the corner. If you're planning on attending, please do RSVP with our office. You can email info@bcschoolsports.ca. I know many of you that are looking for hotel rooms and stuff have already done so, but if you're planning on attending, just as we order food and other things to make sure everyone has a positive experience, we do ask that you RSVP your attendance, even if you're just coming for the day. As usual, we will have the 3 methods of voting: the advance voting, the proxy voting, and the in-person voting. The advance voting will be set up shortly. The information and the pins to access the voting ballot will be sent to the school principal of record in stars. So please, if you're a principal seeing this, make sure you have the correct information in stars, or if you're an athletic director, make sure you speak to your principal and make sure he or she is expecting it and knows what to do with that information when it arrives in a couple of weeks. Lastly, there's a couple webinars we will be doing to answer any questions. Hopefully this video will provide a lot of insight. If there's follow-up questions or discussion, obviously you can reach out to our office at any time. But there will also be 2 webinars that people can come to and ask questions or listen to discussion. The first one will be April 15th at 3:30 p.m. The next one will be April 17th at 3:30 p.m. The information will be available in the meeting package, which will be sent out this week. And from there, you're welcome to join and ask any questions. Moving on to the notices of motion. We started this last year with a video and had a lot of positive feedback about providing a bit of context and background on the motions. It's very difficult for a lot of people that aren't actively involved with BC School Sports on a day-to-day level to understand, sort of, especially when things are written as policy, what the actual effects are And so this video hopefully will provide some context for that. Each individual motion will be time-stamped in the notes below, so if you're only interested in a couple motions, you can skip to those and get the insight that you're looking for. I will start by a bit of a note from the Board of Directors. Last year, for the first time, the board offered board recommendations on each motion. We had a lot of feedback on that. Some of it very positive, some of it very negative, and so the board really looked at that again and said, is this something we want to do? And the answer they came to was yes. Based on our governance structure with 460 voting members, it's extremely difficult to engage and educate everybody appropriately on that. And so, as the board elected by the membership to handle the responsibilities of overseeing the operations and leadership of the organization, they felt that was a prudent thing to do given our governance structure. If we had an alternative structure where it may be more 50 or 60, more of a representative body that was more discussion based, perhaps that wouldn't be required. But given the structure of our voting membership, they felt that it was prudent to do that. They did want to make it explicitly clear that it is a recommendation. There is no obligation or requirement to support that. Obviously, in a democracy situation such as this, not every school is going to agree with every board recommendation, and that's okay. So just want to make sure that's clear to everyone that you aren't required to go with that. It simply is a recommendation from the board based on sort of their perception as the leaders that have been elected by the membership. With that, we will get into the motions. The first motion you'll see is just the appointment of the auditor. We've had the same auditor for a number of years. Both staff, management, and the board are quite happy with that, so there's no change in the recommendation for the auditor. Notice number 1, these are all ordinary resolutions. There's no special resolutions coming to the AGM this year, so these will pass by simple majority. And that will be required basically the 50% plus 1 votes to pass. So notice 1 is the category of membership. This is more of a sort of a cleaning up motion. Currently, right now, the policy states grades 7 through 12 participation in BC school sports. Really, as far as anybody can remember, the intent has always been sort of an 8 through 12 organization philosophically, and this just brings that into alignment. There'll be some motions later on that talk about grade 7 use specifically, and we'll deal with those individually, but this is more just a housekeeping motion to align policy with the general understanding and operations of BC school sports. Notice number 2 talks about registration information. Currently right now, we sort of just roll over membership every year, which has a lot of challenges as some schools choose to be members certain years and not, as well as often we get to a school that has a new administrator. The administrator 25 years ago may have joined, and as such, there isn't a sort of a level of ownership and responsibility at the administration level in each school. So what's proposed is something that's quite common in a lot of provinces and states, that in August every year, as the administrators come back to the buildings, they will have to go into STARS. There will be a portal set up just for administrators. They will have to, 1, opt in to membership with BC School Sports, as well as update the athletic director contact information and the financial person contact information. This will create a lot of efficiencies for BC School Sports. We spend a lot of time in the fall chasing down who the appropriate contact is once people come back to the school, as there's a lot of movement every year. So simply, again, this is just a portal for administrators to declare their membership with BC School Sports. It should be a pretty painless task, but again, it provides a little bit of education and ownership, as well as creating operational efficiencies. Notice 3 speaks to the handbook. Again, this is sort of in line with what a lot of provinces and states do across North America. On occasion, and it is rare, but there is from time to time, policy does change, either after the AGM, before the policy goes, the handbook goes to print, or in extremely rare circumstances, even after the year has started. In that case, it's obviously difficult to educate everyone, and you can't change the printed handbooks that have been sent out. So this basically just states that the official handbook will be the one listed on the BC School Sports website, and that will be, any changes there will be posted there, and that's the official copy. With that said, again, it's rare that any changes do happen, and if they do happen, there's a membership-wide memo and explanation explaining what that is. So it's not that we'll just sort of put it there sneakily or do any of that matter. It will still be transparent and published. It's just from a handbook perspective and a policy perspective, that will be the copy of record. Notice number 4 is more of a housekeeping motion, as it closes a loophole that is found in our joint team policy, and also just creates a little bit more clarity on our category sizes. You'll see in the motion that category sizes are directly linked to the membership fee associated with each school based on the size of school. Right now, that the motion, the joint team policy allows for multiple schools or 3 or more schools to join together, which, inconsistent with the intent of the policy, would make them ineligible for postseason play. But because of that loophole, it would create the ability for them to do so. So simply all we're doing is reversing the categories of membership, so that what was Category 1 will now become Category 8, and what was Category 8 will become Category 1. There's no actual change in the intent or implementation of the policy. It's just, 1, creating some clarity, and 2, closing a loophole of that nature. So. Notice number 5 speaks to the legal contingency fund. For many years, going back to the 90s, BC School Sports has maintained a legal contingency fund. This fund is used to prevent and, if necessary, litigate any legal action that comes against BC School Sports. This fund has a goal target balance of $50,000 to begin each year, and we draw down on that as required, and then there's a levy that is put against the schools to top that back up. The last levy was 2 years ago, and it was $30 per school, just as a reference point. This motion changes slightly more the mechanism for how it's approved. Last year we made a change that allowed, or basically empowered, the board of directors to set the fees at the end of the school year in preparation for the following year, knowing what had happened at the AGM. This follows that same suit, basically, that the board of directors will, when required, institute a legal levy against the schools to maintain that legal fund for the protection of all our schools and the organization. It's kind of consistent with the intent of last year's motion that was passed, as well as it gives the board the ability to kind of execute their fiduciary obligations to the membership. For example, if we receive legal action over the summer, or even even in mid-May, in the middle of spring season, after the AGM, currently there'd be no mechanism for that to be addressed. So again, if the legal levy was ever to be more than $100 per school, which I don't believe it has ever been more than $50 per school at any one year, but if it were more than $100, it would require membership approval. Notice number 6 is proposing a partnership with BC School Sports and the CIAAA. The CIAAA is the Canadian Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association. CIAAA is a professional group that provides leadership training, as well as certification to athletic directors, as well as a host of resources and a network of colleagues to provide support. BC School Sports recognizes that the AD role is a critical role in the school, and in some schools certainly does not receive a lot of support. So hopefully this motion would allow or institute that every member school's athletic director of record and stars would automatically become a member of CIAAA. The cost to every school would be $50 every year, and that would then subsidize the cost of the membership. BC School Sports has partnered with CIAAA to draft an MOU that would provide every new athletic director a free course in their first year as an athletic director. Their second year, they would receive 50% off the course, and then every year after that, they would receive a $25 credit, essentially reducing the cost of the membership to only $25 a year. We think it is a hugely beneficial program, that a similar partnership already exists in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and it will really elevate the ability of our athletic directors to provide quality support and structure for athletic programs across the province. Notice 7 it's long on paper, but it's actually more just a housekeeping motion. We haven't addressed our committee structure in a long time, and many of the committees that are listed in our policy haven't been operational for some time, most of them since I came almost 3 years ago. And so in an effort to ensure that our policy actually reflects our operations and practice, we are updating the entire committee structure, removing those that are no longer in effect, and putting in those that, the ones I spoke about earlier, those committees that are functioning. With that, we are simplifying the policy as it's really the board's responsibility to create policies. So in the handbook, you'll see the purpose and mandate of each committee and the full terms of reference as approved by the board, as well as the committee members will be listed on the BC School Sports website. But the handbook will still provide a reference point for what committees are out there and what their sort of purpose and mandate are. With that, we also encourage you as athletic directors and administrators to consider getting involved in BC School Sports, especially at the committee level, as we're always looking for informed viewpoints and dedicated people to contribute to our growth and development. Notice number 8 is talking about the addition of a new sport. Rugby Sevens has been proposed, and the office staff as well as the board of directors has been working with the Rugby Commission on the way to do this. Right now, what you have in front of you is a motion that suggests rugby be introduced in the 2019-2020 academic year as a demonstration sport. It will be played in the same season of play as 15s, so that's the spring season. So basically, we will run 15s and 7s concurrently. The board, as I mentioned, is working with the commission to ensure that the appropriate safety policies and measures are in place to protect the student athletes, as well as provide opportunities for those schools that have trouble getting 19, 20, 21 kids on a team to safely participate in rugby. Obviously, with Rugby Sevens, that number is quite a bit lower. Sevens, as most of us know, is a growing game. It's an Olympic sport and has a lot of success and history here in BC. So the Commission believes that they can run 15s and 7s concurrently and do so successfully while increasing the opportunities for more students to participate in rugby. That motion would then come back to the membership in the 2020 AGM for approval as a full and official sport once a lot of the details have been worked out with the Commission. So at this point, it's a demonstration sport for a period of 1 year with the intent that it would come back to the 2020 AGM for full approval from the membership. Notice 9 is an update to the recruitment and undue influence policy. BC School Sports has received a lot of feedback over the last couple of years, certainly since I've been here, that one, the policy is a little bit unclear in terms of, or not clear enough in terms of what is and isn't allowed, and secondly, that the barriers to sort of initiating the process are so high that it's not really worth it for any school or person to do. So the board and staff looked at a bunch of different policies, a bunch of different processes that exist, and tried to pull sort of the best of those that allows more clarity around what is prohibited as recruiting an undue influence, and also a process that still has, there's still a significant barrier there, so we're not dealing with hundreds of frivolous complaints, but that perhaps is a little bit less onerous or provides a little bit less roadblock to those people that do wish to have a situation investigated. So this policy essentially is just a rework of that. It provides some clarity and reduces the barriers slightly so that, hopefully it will act as a bigger deterrent and enable us to deal with those schools that may be recruiting a little bit more effectively. Notice 10 is from the Boys Basketball Commission. It speaks to their tiering. It is standard that the Boys Basketball Commission adjust their tiering numbers every 2 years. This is, they just finished the second year of their cycle, so this will be a new 2-year cycle beginning next year. This is consistent with past practices, and it's just adjusted. Their philosophy is to adjust the tiers to be of equal size, which this does. And so again, this is consistent with past practice. Notice 11, also to do with tiering, but with track and field. Track and field is suggesting to move from the current 3 tiers to a 2-tier system, with tiering numbers basically 400 and lower and 401 and higher of grade 11 and 12 students being that threshold. The reason for this was competitively, many smaller schools or the single A schools were winning medals and banners with perhaps only 1 or 2 finishers in the top 8 in any event. But the way the event is structured, that would enable them to win a banner. So this provides a little bit more fairness and equality to all those schools. At the same time, the board has recommended to approve this. However, they still do have some concerns about handing out both, a gendered or a male and a female banner in addition to a combined banner, as well as some of the structural issues that are a result of the things we just talked about with the point system. That said, the board is happy to support this and will continue to work with the commission to figure out solutions to some of those concerns. Notice 12 speaks to the full-time student athlete status. We did a slight update last year to this policy in hopes of clarifying it, and it got us kind of halfway there. And with some of the feedback and questions we received this year, I think now this really sort of clarifies it a little bit more. There's no change in intent of this policy. It's simply for clarity that, again, a student must be in 5 courses throughout the course of the year to be eligible for school sport. And then the proposed language clarifies what is required of students in a semester school system, as well as those that finish graduation requirements in January and do not wish to return back to school for the second half of the year. Again, not a major change at all. It's more just a clarification of the requirements. Notice 13 and notice 14 both have come from schools and are to do with grade 7 participation in BC school sports. And while they are similar in that nature, they're quite different in their approach. Notice 13 speaks to really allowing grade 7s a lot of opportunity to play in BC school sports. And essentially you can see at the top there of the policy, the proposed language indicates that grade 7 students are eligible to participate in BC school sports, provided that some of those factors are met. This would open up grade 7 participation quite a bit more, and with that, the board has recommended not to approve this motion, as they feel that's a fairly large philosophical change in direction, and something of that magnitude really requires a lot of member-wide discussion and feedback. To that effect, there will be some information coming out providing some different information and asking for your feedback regarding this topic shortly. Notice 14, again, as mentioned, deals with grade 7s. However, the intent of this motion is really to allow those really small schools that have grade 7s in their buildings the ability to use them in still a very restricted way, but just in volleyball and basketball specifically, to allow those grade 8 teams to operate with the assistance of some grade 7s. It removes a little bit of the restriction that currently exists, but sort of the philosophical underpinnings remain the same, but provides a small amount of relief for those small schools in categories 5, 6, and 7 that can use grade 7s to a point, limited that they cannot be any up to but no more grade 7s than the number of grade 8s on any specific roster. So again, it speaks to just volleyball, just basketball. Maximum number of grade 7s, it can't exceed the number of grade 8s on a team, but it sort of removes the tie to the minimum number, which was seen as a barrier for a lot of those small schools. The board has suggested to the membership that they approve Notice 14 as they think it's consistent with the current policy and provides a slight amount of wiggle room, as opposed to Notice 13, which is a fairly large philosophical change in direction without sort of appropriate consultation. Notice 15 speaks to individual students playing up to a more senior school. Last year, the membership overwhelmingly removed or altered the policy to restrict the ability for students to bring students up from a middle school or another school for the purposes of playing on their teams. One of the core pillars of BC School Sports is obviously you play for the school that you attend. In addition, some of the research that we found that schools were cutting kids that were actually attending their school to make room for the kids from the middle school that might display more athletic proficiency, as well as it was being used as a recruiting tool to get kids into the building and sort of locked into their school. Additionally, moving a kid from a middle school environment into a high school environment without the natural transition that comes with that, without the teacher support and without their peer group, also can present some challenges for some students. So that was the reason for the motion changing last year. Notice 15 came to us from two different schools, so they have graciously allowed us to sort of present them together. So we did receive two requests of this nature, but essentially they are looking to put back in the ability for large schools to still pull students up from a middle school to their senior secondary school or secondary school level. The board, based on the membership response last year, the board has recommended that to defeat this motion. The board's aware that this has a greater effect on some schools than others, and that is a challenge. However, there's 21 different grade configurations of member schools in BC School Sports, and so every policy will have a slightly different effect on each of those different grade configurations. And so they feel that this policy, as it stands now, is consistent with sort of the values and intent of BC School Sports, whereas the proposed motion in Notice 15 moves away from that slightly. So, and that's the reason for the recommendation to defeat the motion. Notice 16 also deals with individual students playing up to a more senior school. However, it takes a slightly different approach than Notice 15. The authors of this motion have restricted the ability for schools to pull students from middle school to only those that are in a 10 to 12 configuration. However, this policy would allow grade 8s and grade 9s to play up. The board has recommended to defeat this motion as there's obviously similar concerns to the previous motion, especially with a grade 8 student that's really in the middle of middle school moving to a 10 through 12 environment, as well as in most areas or many areas of the province, there are grade 8 leagues and in a lot of cases even grade 9 specific leagues throughout the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley where this motion has come from that don't necessarily prevent students from participating in that manner. So with that, again, I mentioned the 21 different grade configurations and trying to manage or understand and be empathetic to the different implications. However, the board has recommended to defeat this for the rationale that you see included. Notice 17, again, deals with a similar subject, but it comes to us from the Football Commission. Some of you will remember that upon passing the motion last year at the AGM, that the Football Commission and the board worked for sort of a one-year exemption based on the fact that spring practices had already happened and teams were already sort of practicing for the fall season as they are permitted to do by BCSS policy in the spring. With that, the exception will be expiring at the end of this year, and so the Commission has worked to bring this forward. And essentially what it does is similar to the previous motion, but specifically just for football programs, allow those football schools that are in 10 to 12 to bring grade 9 students up only, and they must only play junior varsity. They're not eligible for senior varsity. So essentially the grade 9 kids can move up to the senior school to play junior football. The board has recommended to approve this, and the critical difference here is that there are no grade 9 leagues available for football. There's grade 8, there's junior, and there's senior. So these students literally do not have a place to play. In addition, they also recognize the unique nature of football given the safety requirements and the high number of students required to compete. So the combination of those, the board generally doesn't like recommending motions that target a specific school or a small group of schools or even a small sport, but in this they're cognizant of the challenges and realities that we have to face with football and the fact that there is no place for those students to play, and for that reason they have recommended to approve the motion. Notice 18 is a small modification. I hesitate to call it housekeeping because there's a small change in terms of how the policy is applied. But currently we struggle with a lot of the international students that come in. Sometimes their educational system doesn't align perfectly with ours, and often when they come in they're being placed at a grade level that is consistent with their English capabilities as opposed to their age. And really the current policy sort of lets the school establish what grade they're in. So in some cases we may have an 18-year-old that would be normally graduating and they're placed in a grade 10 level because of their English speaking skills when they arrive. This policy basically states that unless there's evidence to display that the student started grade 8 or equivalent at a certain time, that the birth year will be used as the default year for placing them in an age-appropriate category. Notice 19 is a motion that has come to us from a school. Essentially, what it proposes is that in individual sports, if a student is ruled ineligible for not meeting any of the transfer requirements or residency requirements, that a student athlete may compete as an independent, not affiliated with the school. The board has recommended to defeat this motion. Obviously, it's not consistent with school sport philosophies where you represent your school in competition. In addition, there's also the recognition that if student athletes are sort of permitted to participate in an unaffiliated manner, that is going to inherently remove a space from a student that would be representing their school and potentially gaining points for their school. So it's not that it's restricting, it's not that there's one less space available, it's just one less space available to a school, to a student that's representing a school. So for that, there's a lot of issues that could come up with this motion, and we haven't allowed unaffiliated or independent type athletes at any point, and the board wishes the board recommends to keep that philosophy consistent, where each student athlete should be representing their school, and those that are ineligible are ineligible. I will point out that last year the membership approved a change to the residency rule that brought that more in alignment with the 1 year sitting out period. So if a student doesn't meet residency, historically they had to meet residency before becoming eligible. Now if they don't meet residency but they maintain the same residence and same living situation for a period of 1 year, they do become eligible. So that's consistent with other transfer policies, and with that in mind, the board has suggested to defeat this motion. Notice 20 speaks to athlete gender. BC School Sports has had a gender policy for a number of years, and in fact it was probably quite progressive when it was first introduced 10 to 12 years ago. However, as our society has changed, as has the language used talking about gender, it was time for an update. This policy does a couple things. It updates the terms used. It also provides inclusion for non-gendered students as well as gender fluid students, which currently didn't exist. So essentially it allows non-gendered and gender fluid students to compete with the gender that they feel most comfortable with. Gender fluid students, it allows them to change participation with different genders from season to play, but not within a season of play. So you can't play, boys volleyball one day and then girls volleyball the next. However, you could play boys volleyball and then girls basketball if that is consistent with their gender identity at that time. For those students that are transgendered, the policy has been long in existence that they will compete with a gender that is consistent with their identity. However, the process required medical documentation and was quite onerous and now deemed to be inappropriate, as students that have a gender that is not consistent with their sex. It is not a medical issue. That is not something that should require medical documentation. So that's been changed just to have the student athlete as well as the administration confirm in writing the student's gender identity, at which point they would be able to compete with the gender consistent with their identity. Notice 21 is a little bit of housekeeping. Traditional homeschooling, as it may have existed 15, 20 years ago, has really been eliminated by the creation and rise of distributed learning schools. Essentially, that is what it was, and now it's just more formalized. Students that are truly homeschooled now are not subject to the BC curriculum, nor are they progressing towards a Dogwood certificate. So what we've done is just removed the home study confusion around that, and really just made it, there's alternate schools and there's distributed learning schools. Students that are homeschooled aren't enrolled at a member school, and are not progressing towards Dogwood and are not consistent with sort of the understanding of school sport. So those students are not really eligible for school sport competition. And otherwise, this motion just is clarifying the requirements from alternate and distributed learning students. So not a significant change, more just a cleanup for clarity's purpose. Notice 22 speaks to international and boarding students. Last year at the AGM, the membership passed a motion that ended up to be quite controversial after the fact, in terms of not allowing any students to receive any financial aid, scholarship, bursaries, etc., and remain eligible from an international or boarding standpoint. The board and our partners from FISA and ISABC worked really hard to find a solution that honored the intent of the motion, but yet wasn't quite as punitive and punishing to those students that really it wasn't intended to capture. With the blessing of the authors of the original motion, the board, in one of those rare circumstances, did amend the policy in October. The memo was sent out. As is standard practice, whenever that happens, the motion or the now policy must come forward to the membership to either approve or repeal. So basically what the effect of the motion now is that any student that is either eligible as an international student or eligible as a boarding student must pay 100% of the posted rate, whether that be at their school in an independent school setting or with a district in a public school setting, must pay 100% of that rate. If they receive any subsidization on that, whether that be from financial aid or other funding ways, that the student is required to pay a minimum of $26,000 in tuition after any aid is received. So the effect of that really is most districts charge between $24,000 and $26,000 for international students, of which there is no compensation offered. So this sort of draws or brings the competitive balance in line in terms of those students that might be receiving some financial aid at an independent school are still paying as much, if not more, than those that are choosing to attend a public school. And the response to this has been pretty positive. We haven't had any issues over the course of the year once it came in. I know there's been discussions with our partners at ISABC and FISA looking at different ways that it could be tweaked, and we will be having those discussions moving forward. But right now, the board recommends passing this as it seems to have created a happy medium, at least for now, until the Competitive Fairness Committee can maybe make some recommendations that would accommodate in different ways without restricting certain student athletes from participating. But for now, the recommendation is to approve this motion. Notice 23 is strictly housekeeping. This policy is listed twice in the handbook, so it's just removing it in one spot, leaving it in the other. Quite simple. We just tried not to have the same policy in multiple spots in the handbook, because as things change, then you have to make sure you're changing it in multiple spots as opposed to one. Notice 24 is a significant one. We changed our eligibility structure a couple of years ago and restricted the eligibility officer to passing only what was in policy, with anything sort of beyond that, extraordinary and or compassionate circumstances requiring approval from the Eligibility Appeals Committee. Over the discussions with both members of the committee as well as our eligibility officers and the member schools, we felt it was appropriate to add one more option to the eligibility officer to approve. So those students that are transferring because of a bullying situation at the previous school, if that can be corroborated as per the language in the motion, then the eligibility officer would have the ability to approve that student at that level and would not require that going to the Eligibility Appeals Committee. Essentially, the effect would be schools would be, there would be less administration, there would be less cost, and students would be able to participate sooner, not having to wait for that appeal. So we feel that there's a definition that's there, expectations of what is required. If any of those aren't met, it will still be required to go to the appeals committee. However, the eligibility officer at the first level will have the ability to approve it if those standards are met, which I think is a good thing for all the students. And therefore, the board has recommended to approve that. Notice 25 speaks to sport-specific transfers in our transfer policy. Currently, and it's been the long-standing practice and understanding that students should not be transferring schools for the purposes of sport, and it's implied in various parts of policy, but it's not explicitly stated, nor does it give the eligibility officer the ability to deny a policy on that, deny a transfer based on that policy. So this simply just adds that, and reads that if in the opinion of the eligibility officer, a student athlete transfer is motivated by sport and has previously established their home school, the eligibility officer may deny eligibility on those grounds. Again, it doesn't happen very often. We're obviously looking for ways to make students eligible where possible. However, this does give the office and the eligibility officer the ability to sort of protect the integrity of transfers and school sport for those transfers that are obviously motivated by sport. Notice 26 speaks to the seasons of play and understanding what is required of our member schools for in-season play versus club and community sport that may be affiliated loosely with a school. It provides a lot more understanding of what schools may and may not do. Really, the essence is that obviously some students, as much as we want students to participate in multiple high school sports, we fully understand that some students want to play a certain sport in a club and community setting after or before a high school year. Perfectly okay, but we are aware that the lines of schools and clubs and communities continue to blur. And so in an effort to make sure that that is clear, the expectations of the school as well as the community and club team, so that everyone is clear on what is required. And to that, there should be no use of school uniforms, school colors, school apparel, use of the school name, things like that. And the big one too is that the administration at the school recognizes that it is not a school activity. So therefore, insurance and rental agreements and that type of thing should be in place. Otherwise, if there's a pseudo club team participating as a school activity, then that certainly would be an infraction of the season of play. So again, this is just not really a change in direction or philosophy, but more just some clarity so that what the expectations of the member schools are is clear when it comes to season of play. Notice 27 comes to us from RUGBY. They have requested, or their membership asked them to put this forward and request a spring season or jamboree type situation similar to what football has. The board has recommended to defeat this motion, and the reason for that is, unlike football where their spring season happens sort of outside or in a completely different time of year, what they're requesting is essentially a 2-week extension to the season of play by playing 2 weeks prior to. This year, the season of play started the first week of March for the spring season, and at that point, any schools could participate in rugby. So essentially what they're looking for is to move that back into mid-February to sort of be in alignment with football, but the board doesn't feel that there's any real comparables there. In addition, the 13-week season is in existence, plus spring break also falls in that. So really this season of play is 15 weeks, of which we know that many teams do practice throughout spring break. Lastly, there's many regions of the province that simply just can't get on a field as of early March as it is, never mind in mid-February. So this would create further competitive imbalance or advantages for those schools in the Lower Mainland and really be an unfair situation for those schools that are in either northern or eastern climates where often they can't get on the field until mid to late March as it is. So the board, for those reasons, has recommended to defeat the motion. Finally, the last one is notice number 28. This speaks to really the provincial qualification process. As you know, with the new zones coming in next September, we put out a rezoning guide that provided certain things that sort of had to be in place from a zone and championship perspective, well, which things were still at the discretion of the zone and commission. This just formalizes that into policy. So essentially this sort of mirrors that. The sport commission still determines the berthing for provincials. There's not a significant change in philosophy here, but it just sort of aligns with that document and clarifies for everyone what the expectations are at the zone level as well as at the sport commissioner level. With that is the end of the motions. There's 28 this year. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can contact the office or again, attend one of the webinars that is going to be held on April 15th or April 17th at 3:30. There'll be more information in your package. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope you found this informative, and we look forward to seeing many of you in Kelowna on April 27th. Take care.